The year is 1944, and somewhere over the blood-soaked fields of occupied France, a massive P-47 Thunderbolt fighter screams through the morning sky. Inside the cramped cockpit, Lieutenant James Sullivan wrestles with the control stick, his knuckles white against the leather grip. The oxygen mask pressed against his face tastes like rubber and fear, and through the curved plexiglass canopy, he can see his wingman's aircraft already trailing smoke, spiraling down toward the patchwork farmland below. A Focke-Wulf 190 is locked onto his tail, its cannon fire tearing through the air just feet from his wingtip. Jim can hear the impacts, that distinctive metallic sound of 20mm shells punching through aluminum, and he knows he's seconds away from joining his wingman in that terrible downward spiral. He yanks the stick hard left, desperate to break the pursuit, but the 7-ton American fighter responds like a freight train trying to change tracks. The German pilot knows this. Everyone knows this. The Thunderbolt is a beast in a straight line, a powerhouse in a dive, but in a turning fight, it's supposed to be a coffin with wings. Jim has watched 11 men die in the past 2 months because of this fundamental fact. Good pilots, trained pilots, men who did everything right, but still ended up as burning wrecks scattered across the French countryside because their aircraft couldn't turn fast enough when it mattered. Except Jim's plane isn't responding like every other P-47 in the squadron. His aircraft snaps into the turn with shocking agility, the nose coming around with an immediacy that defies everything Jim knows about the Thunderbolt's handling characteristics. He tightens the radius, pulling harder, the G-forces compressing his chest until breathing becomes a conscious effort. The pursuing Focke-Wulf, committed to its firing pass and expecting the American fighter to wallow through the turn like it always does, suddenly has nowhere to go. The German pilot flashes past Jim's canopy in a blur of gray and black crosses, so close that Jim can see the pilot's face through the cockpit glass, see the expression of confusion and sudden fear. Jim reverses hard, his vision tunneling as the G-forces crush him into his seat, the edges of his sight going gray and then black before the blood returns to his brain. When his vision clears, he's on the German's tail, the perfect firing position that every fighter pilot dreams of, and few survive long enough to achieve repeatedly. 3 seconds later, his 850 caliber machine guns roar to life, the entire airframe shuddering with the recoil, and the enemy fighter disintegrates in a fountain of flame and twisted metal. Pieces of the Focke-Wulf tumble through the sky like burning confetti, and Jim banks away hard, scanning for more threats, his heart hammering so hard he can feel it in his temples. When Jim lands back at the base in Bodney, England, his hands are still shaking as he shuts down the massive radial engine. The other pilots crowd around his aircraft before the propeller has even stopped spinning, demanding to know how he managed to outturn a 190. They're not just curious, they're desperate. Every single one of them has felt the horror of fighting their own aircraft in combat, of needing the plane to respond now and feeling it lag behind their inputs. Jim's answer is simple. He climbs down from the wing, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cold November air, and points to a section of wire looped around a specific part of his control linkage, installed by a mechanic who everyone thought was losing his mind. The modification looks absurdly simple, almost crude, just a loop of wire carefully shaped and positioned. But Jim tells them that this piece of wire saved his life today, just like it saved his life 3 days ago and the week before that. He tells them about a mechanic named Frank Morrison who refused to accept that good enough was actually good enough when pilots were dying. If you want to discover how one man's obsession changed aerial combat in World War II, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't believe where this story goes. The story begins 3 months earlier in the cold, perpetually damp maintenance hangar of the 352nd Fighter Group. Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison is hunched over a workbench surrounded by scattered blueprints, springs, lengths of piano wire, and control cables pulled from the half a dozen Thunderbolts. The concrete floor beneath his boots is stained with decades of oil and hydraulic fluid, and the November wind whistles through gaps in the hangar doors, carrying with it the smell of aviation fuel and English rain. Frank is 37 years old, which makes him ancient by the standards of a combat airbase where most pilots haven't seen their 23rd birthday. His hands are scarred from years of working with metal and machinery, calluses built up over 2 decades of turning wrenches and forming sheet metal. His face is lined with exhaustion that goes deeper than just missing sleep, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. Before the war, Frank ran a small aircraft repair shop outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a modest operation that barely kept him and his wife afloat during the Depression years. He fixed crop dusters for farmers who paid in chickens and vegetables when they couldn't scrape together cash. He maintained private planes for the occasional wealthy businessmen who flew into the local airfield. He once kept a 1923 Curtiss Jenny flying for a barnstormer who performed at county fairs, patching that old biplane back together with ingenuity and spare parts because the barnstormer couldn't afford proper replacements. Frank has seen every kind of control system failure, every shortcut, every modification that Bush pilots swore by and that sometimes worked and sometimes killed them. He learned early that there's a difference between clever and safe, that the best modification in the world is worthless if it fails at the worst possible moment. His shop might have been small, but it had a reputation for honest work and aircraft that didn't fall out of the sky. That reputation meant everything to Frank, meant more than profit or expansion, because he understood that every time someone climbed into a cockpit, they were trusting their life to the work he'd done with his hands. But nothing prepared him for the industrial-scale death machine that is the European Air War. Frank volunteered for service the day after Pearl Harbor, expecting to serve his country and maybe teach some young kids how to keep their planes flying. His wife Martha begged him not to go, reminded him that at his age, with his experience, he could get a job at any aircraft factory stateside, make good money, stay safe. But Frank couldn't shake the image of those burning ships in Hawaii, couldn't stomach the idea of sitting out the war while younger men did the fighting. He kissed Martha goodbye at the train station in Harrisburg, promised her he'd come home and joined a flood of men heading to war with more determination than sense. What he found instead was a horrifying equation written in blood and burning aluminum. Every week, fresh-faced pilots arrive at Bodney, full of confidence and training. They've logged hundreds of hours in training aircraft. They know their emergency procedures. They can recite recognition silhouettes of every German fighter and bomber in the Luftwaffe inventory. They're good pilots, prepared pilots, ready pilots. Every week, a third of them don't come back. Their bunks are emptied, their personal effects packed up and shipped home to parents or wives or sweethearts who will never see them again. Their names are recorded in official logs, their aircraft numbers reassigned to replacement planes, and the war grinds forward without pause or mercy. The math is brutal and simple. In turning engagements with German fighters, the P-47 is at a lethal disadvantage. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109 are lighter, more agile, designed specifically for dogfighting. They can outturn the Thunderbolt, and in aerial combat, the tighter turn often means the winning position. Frank has studied the after-action reports, read the combat narratives written by pilots who survived encounters that killed their wingmen. The pattern is always the same. A P-47 gets into a turning fight, the pilot needs instant response from his controls, and the aircraft lags just enough to put him in the kill zone instead of the firing position. 0.7 seconds. That's the average delay Frank has calculated between control input and full aileron response. Less than a single second. In normal flight, it's barely noticeable. In combat, when two fighters are maneuvering at 300 miles per hour and every degree of turn matters, 0.7 seconds is an eternity. It's the difference between getting your guns on target or having guns pointed at you. It's the difference between landing with victory rolls or auguring into French farmland at terminal velocity. The problem isn't the engine or the guns. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp is a masterpiece of American engineering, producing over 2,000 horsepower. 18 cylinders of precisely machined metal turning fuel into thrust with impressive efficiency. The 8 Browning machine guns can saw a Messerschmitt in half, each gun firing at nearly 1,000 rounds per minute, creating a cone of fire that can shred another aircraft in seconds if the pilot can get his plane into position. The Thunderbolt can absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying, can dive faster than any German fighter, can deliver devastating ground attack strikes. But when a pilot yanks the stick in a dogfight, the massive control surfaces of the Thunderbolt take too long to respond. The aileron cables stretch under load, the linkages compress, and precious fractions of a second are lost. Fractions that mean the difference between shooting and being shot, between survival and a fireball that was once a 22-year-old kid from Iowa or Georgia or New York. Frank has watched it happen. He's pulled dead pilots out of crumpled cockpits, their bodies broken by crashes that happened because they couldn't turn fast enough. He's listened to the survivors describe how they fought their own aircraft, how the controls felt mushy and unresponsive exactly when they needed instant reaction. One pilot, a lieutenant named Carlson, told Frank about a fight over the channel where he knew exactly what maneuver he needed to execute, knew exactly how to get into a firing position, but his aircraft simply wouldn't respond fast enough. Carlson survived because the German pilot made a mistake, not because Carlson's plane did what he needed it to do. 2 weeks later, Carlson's luck ran out over Normandy, and Frank helped pull what was left of him from a Thunderbolt that looked like it had been through a shredder. The official response from Republic Aviation, the company that builds the Thunderbolts, is always the same. The aircraft is performing within specifications. Control surface response is adequate for the aircraft's intended role. Pilots need to use the P-47's strengths, maintain energy, avoid prolonged turning engagements. The recommendations are tactically sound. The specifications are technically accurate. And none of it changes the fact that young men are dying in situations where better control response would save them. Frank has read those reports, and every time he does, rage burns in his chest like aviation fuel. Adequate. The word makes him want to put his fist through a wall. Adequate means pilots die. Adequate means families get telegrams. Adequate means empty bunks and personal effects shipped home in wooden crates. Adequate means Frank has to look young men in the eye, knowing he's sending them up in aircraft that will betray them at the worst possible moment. So Frank stops sleeping. He starts spending every off-duty hour in the hangar, studying the control systems of the P-47 like a man possessed. He traces every cable, every pulley, every connection point from the control stick in the cockpit all the way to the massive ailerons on the wings. He measures the free play in the system, calculates the stretch in the cables under load, maps out every point where slop and compression rob the pilot of instant response. He fills notebook after notebook with calculations, sketches, measurements. He borrows technical manuals from the engineering office, studies them until he can visualize the entire control system in his mind, until he dreams about cable tensions and pulley ratios and control surface mechanics. The other mechanics think he's cracking up, losing his grip on reality under the strain of too many dead pilots and too many impossible problems. They watch him work through the night, hunched over his bench with a single lamp and a cup of terrible coffee, and they shake their heads and mutter about obsession and burnout. The pilots are too busy trying to stay alive to notice what one old mechanic is doing with wire and calipers, too focused on their own survival to care about the technical details of how their aircraft work. But Frank doesn't care about their opinions. He cares about the problem, and he's beginning to see a solution, beginning to understand the fundamental issue in a way that the engineers at Republic Aviation either don't see or don't consider important enough to address. The insight comes to him at 3 a.m, sitting in the cold hangar with a cup of terrible coffee and a control cable assembly laid out on his bench. Outside, the wind is howling across the airfield, and somewhere in the distance, he can hear the rumble of bombers returning from a night raid over Germany. The hangar is lit by a single lamp, casting harsh shadows across the workbench, and Frank's eyes are burning from exhaustion and too many hours staring at technical drawings. The issue isn't any single component. It's the cumulative effect of dozens of small flexions and compressions throughout the entire system. When a pilot moves the stick, that input has to travel through nearly 20 feet of cable, around multiple pulleys, through several connection points, before it finally reaches the aileron actuator. Each of those points absorbs a tiny amount of force. Each cable stretches microscopically under load. Each connection compresses slightly. The individual measurements are almost impossible to detect with standard tools. A cable might stretch 1/16 of an inch under combat loads. A pulley bearing might have 3/1000 of an inch of play. A connection point might compress by a 64th of an inch. Individually, these losses are negligible, barely worth mentioning in a technical report. Collectively, they add up to a delay that kills pilots. Frank does the math, adding up all the microscopic losses, all the tiny compressions and stretches. The total comes to roughly 1/4 of an inch of lost motion between the control stick and the aileron surface. 1/4 of an inch translated over 20 feet of control system equals 0.7 seconds of delayed response. 7/10 of a second that might as well be 7 years when someone is shooting at you. The solution, Frank realizes, isn't to replace the entire system. That would be impossible, would require a complete redesign of the aircraft, would take years and millions of dollars in engineering resources that don't exist. It's to eliminate the cumulative slop with a single modification at the most critical point. He needs to create a mechanical advantage, a pre-tensioning system that takes up all the free play before the pilot even moves the stick. Frank starts experimenting with different approaches, working through the night and into the following day, ignoring the schedule that says he's supposed to be on other maintenance duties. He tries stronger springs, thinking he can pull the slack out of the system with tension. The springs either aren't strong enough to make a difference, or are so strong they bind the controls, creating a different kind of danger. He experiments with stiffer cables, sourcing different materials from supply, but stiffer cables create their own problems, increasing friction in the pulleys and making the controls heavier to move. He tries modified pulleys with tighter bearing tolerances, manufacturing them himself on the base machine shop's lathe, but the improvement is marginal and doesn't address the fundamental problem. Nothing works the way he needs it to. Every modification either fails to solve the problem or creates new problems that are just as bad. Frank is starting to think he's chasing an impossible solution, that maybe the engineers at Republic Aviation are right, and this is just an inherent limitation of the design that has to be accepted. Then, almost by accident, while testing yet another failed spring configuration, he discovers the answer. A loop of high-tensile piano wire carefully shaped and positioned, creating constant tension on the aileron control linkage. The wire loop acts like a mechanical memory, pulling the system taut and eliminating every fraction of an inch of slop. The genius of the design is its simplicity. The loop provides constant preload on the control cables. but because of its specific shape and mounting position, it doesn't restrict the range of motion or significantly increase the force required to move the controls. When the pilot moves the stick, the control surfaces respond instantly because there's no slack left to take up, no accumulated compression to overcome. The loop essentially eliminates the dead space in the system without compromising any other aspect of aircraft performance or safety. Frank builds his first prototype and installs it on a P-47 that's scheduled for a test flight. The pilot, a lieutenant named Kowalski, takes the aircraft up expecting a routine systems check, just another morning of making sure everything works before the afternoon's combat mission. The modifications Frank makes are invisible from the cockpit. Nothing looks or feels different when Kowalski pre-flights the aircraft and climbs into the seat. He comes back 20 minutes later with his eyes wide and his hands shaking with excitement, the kind of adrenaline response that usually comes from combat, not from a systems check flight. Kowalski corners Frank on the flight line, talking so fast the mechanic can barely understand him, words tumbling out in a rush of enthusiasm and disbelief. The plane turned like nothing he's ever experienced. The controls felt alive, responsive, immediate. It was like flying a different aircraft, like suddenly discovering that his car has twice the horsepower it's supposed to have. Kowalski describes executing a series of hard turns at combat speeds, maneuvers he's done 100 times before in training in combat. Every previous time, the Thunderbolt wallowed through the turns, the controls feeling loose and imprecise. This time, the aircraft snapped into each turn, the nose tracking exactly where he pointed it, the whole plane feeling connected to his hands in a way it never had before. He actually scared himself on the first hard turn, over-controlling and nearly exceeding the aircraft's structural limits because he wasn't expecting that kind of response. Frank makes Kowalski promise not to tell anyone yet, not until he's sure the modification is safe and repeatable. The last thing Frank needs is word getting out about an unauthorized modification before he's absolutely certain it won't kill someone. Kowalski agrees, but Frank can see the lieutenant is bursting to tell the other pilots, knows that keeping the secret is going to be nearly impossible in the close quarters of a combat squadron, where information spreads like wildfire. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank works in secret, refining his design with an obsessive attention to detail that borders on paranoid. He adjusts the gauge of the wire, experimenting with different thicknesses, until he finds the exact diameter that provides sufficient tension without risk of fatigue failure. He experiments with different loop configurations, testing various shapes and sizes, measuring the effect each variation has on control response. He tests various mounting points, determining which location in the control system provides the best results without creating stress points that could lead to catastrophic failure. He's obsessive about safety, running stress calculations until his eyes blur, checking and retouching every installation, testing each wire loop to destruction to understand its failure characteristics. The wire has to be strong enough to handle combat loads, the violent maneuvers and high-G turns that push the aircraft to its structural limits, but flexible enough not to bind the controls or create dangerous feedback. It has to be positioned precisely, or it won't work, and if it's positioned incorrectly, it could actually make the problem worse or create an entirely new hazard. Get it wrong, and he could kill someone just as surely as the Germans, maybe even more pilots than the modification saves. Frank installs the modification on 3 more aircraft, choosing pilots he trusts to give him honest feedback. All 3 come back with the same report. The planes handle like different machines. Turns are sharper. Control response is instantaneous. The whole aircraft feels more connected to the pilot's intentions. One pilot, a kid from Iowa named Henderson, nearly crashes because he overcontrols on his first landing, not expecting the plane to respond so quickly to his inputs. Word starts to spread through the squadron, but it spreads quietly. Pilots start requesting specific tail numbers, the ones with Frank's modification. They don't talk about it openly because they're worried someone in authority will shut it down. The military doesn't like unauthorized modifications, especially ones that involve safety-critical systems. Frank knows he's operating in a gray area, possibly crossing into conduct that could get him court-martialed. But every morning he watches young men climb into their cockpits knowing some of them won't return. Every evening he counts the empty places in the mess hall. The official channels have failed these pilots. Someone has to do something. Consequences be damned. The breaking point comes during a massive bomber escort mission over Germany. The 352nd is tasked with protecting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, hitting industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley, deep in enemy territory where the Luftwaffe defends with everything they have. The briefing that morning is tense, the intelligence officer marking up the map, with expected fighter concentrations, flak batteries, and emergency landing fields. Everyone in the room knows this is going to be a bad one. The Germans have been bleeding strength for months, but they're fighting harder than ever over their homeland, throwing up everything they can to stop the bomber streams that are systematically destroying their industrial capacity. The Thunderbolts take off in the pre-dawn darkness, forming up in the gray English sky before turning east toward the Channel and the continent beyond. Jim Sullivan is leading a flight of 4 aircraft, and 3 of them have Frank's modification installed. The 4th pilot, a replacement who just arrived from the States, is flying a standard P-47 because Frank hasn't had time to modify every aircraft in the squadron yet. That difference will matter before the day is over. They rendezvous with the bomber formation over the Channel, the massive 4-engine fortresses droning along in their combat boxes, each one bristling with machine guns and carrying tons of high explosive. The crossing into enemy territory is uneventful, but as they approach the target area, the radio starts crackling with contact reports. Bandits at 12 o'clock high. Large formation, looks like 109s and 190s mixed. Coming down fast. German fighters swarm the bombers like angry hornets, diving through the formations in pairs and fours, their cannon fire punching holes in aluminum and flesh. The Thunderbolts dive in to break up the attacks, and suddenly the sky becomes a 3-dimensional nightmare of turning, burning aircraft. Jim Sullivan finds himself in a swirling dogfight with 4 Messerschmitt 109s, the kind of situation that usually means death for a Thunderbolt pilot. The 109 is lighter, more agile, purpose-built for this kind of close-in combat where maneuverability matters more than firepower or durability. Under normal circumstances, this is a death sentence, a fight Jim should avoid at all costs. But Jim's P-47 responds to his every input like it's reading his mind, like the aircraft has become an extension of his body rather than a separate machine he has to fight. He snaps through reversal turns that should be impossible for a Thunderbolt, the nose coming around with shocking speed, the whole aircraft pivoting on its axis in ways that defy everything Jim learned about the plane's handling characteristics in training. He stays inside that turning radius of fighters that outweigh his by 3 tons, matching their maneuvers turn for turn, using the instant control response to position himself for brief firing opportunities. Each time a Messerschmitt commits to a firing pass, expecting the Thunderbolt to wallow through its defensive turn, Jim's aircraft snaps around faster than the German pilot anticipates. The enemy fighters keep overshooting, their pilots clearly confused by a Thunderbolt that's behaving unlike any they've encountered before. Jim's gun camera will later show him achieving firing solutions that should be impossible, getting his guns on target in situations where the geometry of the fight says he should be the one getting shot at. When the fight ends, 2 Messerschmitts are smoking craters on German soil, their pilots never making it out of their cockpits. A 3rd limps away trailing coolant, its pilot desperately trying to make it back to base before the engine seizes. The 4th breaks off and runs, apparently deciding that discretion is the better part of valor when facing a Thunderbolt that refuses to play by the established rules. Jim is heading home with his aircraft full of holes but still flying, the rugged construction of the P-47 proving its worth once again. His wingmen flying the modified aircraft all make it back as well. The replacement pilot in the unmodified plane doesn't. His last radio transmission was a desperate call for help as 3 Focke-Wulfs boxed him in, taking advantage of exactly the control lag that Frank's modification eliminates. They find his aircraft 2 days later, scattered across a farmer's field 20 miles from the target. 3 other pilots with Frank's modification survive encounters that should have killed them, coming back with stories that sound like exaggerations until you see their gun camera footage and realize they're actually understating what happened. The squadron's loss rate for that mission is half what it usually is, and the difference is statistically significant enough that even the most skeptical observers have to acknowledge something has changed. The numbers are impossible to ignore, and numbers are what the military runs on. Major William Carson, the squadron commander, calls Frank into his office the next morning. Frank expects the worst. Court-martial, maybe imprisonment, definitely the end of his military career. Instead, Carson closes the door, pulls out a bottle of scotch, and pours 2 glasses. The major is a combat pilot with 14 confirmed kills, a man who understands exactly what Frank has done and why. Carson tells Frank that he's going to authorize the modification for every aircraft in the squadron, and he's going to personally write a report to Fighter Command, recommending it be adopted across the entire 8th Air Force. But first, they need to do this properly. Frank needs to document everything, create installation procedures that any competent mechanic can follow, establish safety protocols and inspection criteria. Carson is going to assign 2 other mechanics to work with Frank full-time. They have 1 week to systematize the modification before the official inspection team arrives. Frank barely sleeps during that week. He works around the clock, writing technical manuals in longhand, training the other mechanics, personally supervising every installation. The wire loops have to be fabricated to exact specifications, the tension calibrated precisely for each aircraft. There's no room for error, no shortcuts. By the time the inspection team arrives from 8th Air Force headquarters, 23 P-47s in the squadron have been modified, and Frank has a complete documentation package ready for review. The inspection team consists of 3 engineers from Republic Aviation and a colonel from the Fighter Command technical staff. They are, predictably, skeptical and more than a little hostile. This is an unauthorized field modification to a critical flight control system. People could die. Lawsuits could happen. Regulations exist for good reasons. Frank listens to their concerns and then quietly asks if they'd like to see a demonstration. He arranges for 2 aircraft to fly a series of comparison tests, one with the modification and one without. The same pilot flies both planes through identical maneuvers. The difference is so obvious that even the engineers, who arrive determined to shut this down, have to acknowledge something significant is happening. The colonel makes a phone call to Fighter Command. 2 days later, a test pilot arrives from Wright Field, the Army Air Force's primary testing facility. His name is Captain Robert Matthews, and he has more flight hours and more aircraft types than anyone Frank has ever met. Matthews is polite, professional, and completely skeptical. He's seen 100 field modifications that mechanics swore would change everything. 99 of them were garbage, or dangerous, or both. He takes up a modified P-47 expecting to find a placebo effect, something that feels different but doesn't actually change performance. 30 minutes later, he lands and immediately asks to fly an unmodified aircraft for comparison. After that flight, he asks to take the modified plane back up again. When he finally climbs out of the cockpit, Matthews is shaking his head in disbelief. He's been a test pilot for 6 years, and he's never seen a modification this simple have such a profound effect. The official report from Captain Matthews lands on desks at the Pentagon like a bomb. He doesn't just recommend adopting Frank's modification. He states, in clear, unambiguous language, that failing to implement this across the entire P-47 fleet would constitute negligent homicide. The control response improvement is measurable, repeatable, and dramatic. In simulated combat maneuvers, modified aircraft consistently achieve firing positions faster and evade attacks more effectively. The modification increases pilot survival probability by an estimated 15 to 20%. Matthews' report includes full technical specifications, installation procedures, and a recommendation that Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison be immediately promoted and assigned to oversee fleet-wide implementation. The bureaucracy moves with surprising speed after that. Within 3 weeks, Republic Aviation has incorporated Frank's modification into the production line for new P-47s. Retrofit kits are being manufactured and distributed to every Thunderbolt squadron in Europe and the Pacific. Frank suddenly finds himself pulled from his squadron and assigned to a training team, traveling from base to base, teaching mechanics how to install and maintain the modification. He hates leaving his unit, hates being away from the daily work of keeping planes flying, but he understands the importance of what he's doing. Every mechanic he trains will modify dozens of aircraft. Every modified aircraft will save lives. The math is different now, and it's in their favor. 6 months after Frank first installed his wire loop on Lieutenant Kowalski's plane, modified P-47 Thunderbolts are operating across every theater of the war. Pilots report better control response. Maintenance crews appreciate the simple and robust design, and the statistical analysis shows a clear reduction in combat losses. Frank receives a commendation, a promotion to Master Sergeant, and a letter from the Commanding General of the 8th Air Force. The letter thanks him for his service and notes that his innovation has saved an estimated 200 lives in the European theater alone. That number will only grow as the war continues. But the moment that matters most to Frank happens on a rainy afternoon in England, 3 weeks before the war ends. He's back at Bodney for a brief visit, checking on his old squadron, making sure the modifications are still being maintained properly. Jim Sullivan, now a captain with 11 confirmed kills, finds Frank in the hangar and pulls him aside. Jim doesn't say much. He's never been good with words, but he grabs Frank's hand and shakes it, and there are tears in his eyes. Jim tells Frank that he has a wife and a baby daughter he's never met. He tells Frank that without that modification, he would be dead 6 times over. He tells Frank that there are at least 20 guys in the squadron who know they're alive because an old mechanic refused to accept that adequate was good enough. Frank doesn't know what to say to that, so he just nods and tells Jim to go home to his family when this is all over. After Jim leaves, Frank sits alone in the hangar for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof. He thinks about all the pilots who didn't make it home, the ones he couldn't save, the telegrams and the empty bunks and the personal effects shipped home in wooden crates. He thinks about the pilots who did make it home, who will grow old and have children and grandchildren, who will live full lives because a wire loop bought them fractions of a second when it mattered most. Frank Morrison never becomes famous. His name doesn't appear in history books or documentary films. The official military designation for his modification is simply Control System Enhancement Field Modification 77 Charlie, a bureaucratic label that says nothing about the man who created it or the lives it saved. After the war, Frank goes back to Pennsylvania and reopens his small aircraft repair shop. He works on crop dusters and private planes, teaches young mechanics the trade, lives a quiet life. But sometimes, late at night, former pilots track him down. They show up at his shop unannounced, men in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and they shake his hand and thank him for giving them the chance to grow old. Frank always tells them the same thing. He was just doing his job, trying to solve a problem, making sure the planes worked the way they needed to work. But the pilots know the truth. One man, armed with nothing but wire and determination and an absolute refusal to accept unnecessary death, changed the course of aerial combat in World War II. He did it not because he was ordered to, not because he expected recognition, but because when he saw young men dying in machines that could be better, he decided that adequate was not acceptable. That's the real story of the wire loop modification. Not the technical specifications or the official reports, but the fierce determination of one mechanica who looked at an impossible problem and refused to walk away until he'd fixed it, no matter what it cost him personally, no matter what risks he took. In the end, Frank Morrison's legacy isn't measured in commendations or promotions. It's measured in the lives saved, the families that stayed whole, the futures that were allowed to unfold because fractions of a second meant the difference between living and dying. His modification flew on thousands of aircraft in countless combat missions across multiple theaters of war. It's still studied today by aerospace engineers as an example of elegant problem solving, of how deep understanding of mechanical systems can produce transformative results with minimal intervention. But for Frank, the only number that ever mattered was simple. How many pilots came home who wouldn't have otherwise? Everything else was just engineering.